I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak on the subject of women and peace. And I want to begin by addressing the issue of why it is that such a subject is treated. What is the connection between women and peace? I think that connection is found in some very unusual and very striking statements from the World Centre of the Faith. For example, Abdu'l-Baha has written, "When the equality of men and women shall be realized, the foundation of war will be utterly destroyed. Without equality, this is impossible." And more recently, the Universal House of Justice, in their statement, The Promise of World Peace, wrote, "The emancipation of women, the achievement of full equality between the sexes, is one of the most important, though less acknowledged, prerequisites of peace." What I understand from these statements is that there are two very basic questions in the world. One is the achievement of the equality of men and women, the other the attainment of world peace. And these statements from Abdu'l-Baha and from the House of Justice ally these two issues, ally them, and moreover point out that one is a prerequisite to the other. It follows from that with our concern for the achievement of world peace, we must necessarily direct our attention somewhat to the question of the equality of men and women and how this is to be realized through the power and influence of the Baha'i teachings. So tonight I want to consider three principal issues. Firstly, the question of the equality of men and women. Secondly, the linkage between the role of women and the achievement of peace. And thirdly and briefly, the means that are open to the Baha'i community to foster the implementation of this equality. We do this in context of the present day environment, where the world around us exhibits a wide spectrum of views. On the one extreme, the rise and growing influence of conservative fundamentalism in religion and in philosophy, which is largely antagonistic to the granting of greater rights to women, and on the other extreme, anti-male fanaticism with the extreme fringe of the feminist movement. We also must consider this question in context of the fact that the Universal House of Justice has, in its statement on peace, offered the world Baha'i community as a model for the achievement of unity, and has warned us that with our emergence from obscurity, more and more shrewd, skeptical, and even suspicious people will scrutinize the Baha'i community, will examine our record of achievement and behavior in an attempt to find discrepancy between statements of our teachings and our present day practice. So all of these are the context with which we examine the question of the equality of men and women and the efforts being made by the worldwide Baha'i community to put it into practice. I want to begin by spending some time making a brief historical survey of the status and treatment of women down through the ages. And one might say, well, why do this? Why don't we just examine the Baha'i teachings and see what they say? My response to that question is that I think it is useful for us to look at the manner in which women have been treated historically, because it provides a backdrop with which to adequately view and appreciate the Baha'i principles, to appreciate their novelty, their significance, and their far-reaching consequence. It also enables us to better comprehend the challenge we face as Baha'is to bring about the implementation of our principles in a non-Baha'i environment which largely functions according to a different approach. Let me begin by looking over a sense of history at the manner in which women have been regarded from a historical perspective. This, of course, is a controversial subject. there are some people who feel that women have been treated quite badly through history. There are others who maintain that this is an exaggeration, that in fact it hasn't been quite so bad. And one can find at times disagreement, even argument, in the larger society and perhaps even within the Baha'i community over the manner in which women have been treated down through history. Well, this question is very easily resolved. It's resolved by our turning to the authoritative statements of Abdu'l-Baha and seeing what he says about the manner in which women have been treated over the course of history. And let me read to you two passages from Abdu'l-Baha on this subject. Firstly, he says, "In past ages, it was held that woman and man were not equal. That is to say, woman was considered inferior to man even from the standpoint of her anatomy and creation. She was considered especially inferior in intelligence, and the idea prevailed universally that it was not allowable for her to step into the arena of important affairs. In some countries, men went so far as to believe and teach that woman belonged to a sphere lower than human." And one more of the many passages from Abdu'l-Baha on this subject, he said, "Formerly in India, Persia, and throughout the Orient, she, that is woman, was not considered a human being. Certain Arab tribes counted their women in with their livestock. In their language, the noun for woman also meant donkey. That is the same name applied to both, and a man's wealth was accounted by the number of these beasts of burden he possessed. The worst insult one could hurl at a man was to cry out, 'Thou woman!' In former times it was considered wiser that woman should not know how to read or write. She should occupy herself only with drudgery." So we can see that Abdu'l-Baha has very clearly and very succinctly expressed to us the manner in which women have been generally treated down through the ages. Why did Abdu'l-Baha write this? What does he mean with these very strong statements that I have read? I think when we look at the record of history, we find that the manner in which inequality has been expressed concerning women can be categorized into a number of images or a number of historical views about women. For example, one view in history was woman as being inferior, allied with Mother Nature. Woman as a source of fertility, having access to a mysterious, uncontrollable power. Woman used to sacrifice the forces of nature. We see this in the great mother goddesses of antiquity and in the analogies used in the Old Testament in the Song of Solomon. Woman was regarded as having a mysterious power to be controlled with taboos and purification rites. Another historical view in which woman was treated as unequal was woman as enchantress, as an agent of evil, expressed through the use of sexuality to cause the downfall of man by his seduction from the exalted purposes of his life. Hence women were to be veiled and confined because of their sexual promiscuity. We see this today, echoes of it in the treatment of rape victims, where quite often the defense is that the woman brought it on herself. She had it coming, the way she behaved or the way she dressed. Another view was woman as inferior, as a different mode of being, irrational, moody, emotional, not capable of receiving education. Another unequal expression of the treatment of woman, and quite often found in Orthodox religion, was woman as a model of virtue. Pious, virginal, obedient, meek and submissive to the male, occupied entirely with domestic work, with no legal or political power, and a woman who refers all questions which have any intellectual element to them to a man, to her husband, her father, or her brother. This view, of course, pertained over a great deal of recorded history and became embodied even in some legal codes. The Napoleonic Civil Code in France in 1804 said, "Those persons without rights at law are minors, married women, criminals, and the mentally deficient." Women had no rights at law under the Napoleonic Code of 1904. Schopenhauer wrote that women should be under restriction, and by their very nature they require a guardian, and that they are made for obedience. So these various and other views of women were ways in which inequality was expressed. What has religion done about this? Again, we find the subject to be controversial. When we look at the role of religion in the treatment of women, there is again a wide spectrum of views, and once again we turn to the sacred and authoritative writings of our religion for guidance. Examining these Baha'i texts, I find three basic principles which help me to understand the way in which women have been treated in religion. The first is expressed in a statement of Baha'u'llah, where he says, "Women and men have been and will always be equal in the sight of God." So one principle, equality in the sight of God. The second principle is that of women having greater moral courage. Abdu'l-Baha says, "The woman has greater moral courage than the man. She has also special gifts which enable her to govern in moments of danger and crisis." And the third principle is that religions historically have placed men above women. Abdu'l-Baha says, "He, that is Baha'u'llah, establishes the equality of man and woman. This is peculiar to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, for all other religions have placed man above woman." So, three principles: equality in the sight of God, woman having greater moral courage, and all religions have placed man above woman. These three principles, I believe, are the foundation to illuminate examination of the way in which religions have treated women. We find, for example, on the question of equality in the sight of God, we can look in the authentic texts of the major religions of the world and find wonderful statements expressing this spiritual equality in the words of the manifestations of God, where those words are extant in authentic form. So this equality is found in the Quran, in passages in the New Testament, in Galatians, as well as in other sacred books. The second principle is that of moral courage. As Abdu'l-Baha says, woman has greater moral courage than man. And when we look at religious history, we find that women have played a disproportionate role in the early days of each religion, giving it strength, conviction, and governance. For example, consider the role of Mary Magdalene in Christianity, the role of Khadija in her support of Muhammad in the early days of his dispensation, and Fatima's courage in support of Muhammad when he was subject to great persecution. Look at the record of Tahirih, Nawab, Bahir Khanum in the time of Abdu'l-Baha and the Guardian. Bahir Khanum's courageous support to Abdu'l-Baha and the Guardian, her governance for a temporary period in the early days of the guardianship. In these and other examples in religious history, we find this moral courage of which Abdu'l-Baha speaks. And the third principle, that religions have placed man above woman. I think we have to here distinguish between social principles and spiritual value. certainly when we look at the various religions of the world, we find there was a social distinction between men and women due to the prevailing social conditions or mores of the environment. Men were protectors of women and the like. However, the key issue, I believe, is not that of the social principles in the teachings of the various religions. It is rather that of the spiritual value of men in relationship to women. And here I believe that the record shows subjugation of women associated with the rise of a male priesthood and of a theology in each religion generally determined by males. And that, I think, has been the crucial issue in the treatment of women in religion, that with the passage of time, with the rise of a priesthood, with the development of a theology, religions tended to assign greater value to the men than to the women. For example, in the Talmud, we find this statement, "Blessed art thou, O Lord, who has not made me a Gentile, an idiot, or a woman," in the Talmud. And in Corinthians, in the New Testament, women should keep silence in the churches. They are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as even the law says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. It is shameful for a woman to speak in church. The Christian theologians condemned women. Tertullian, in the 2nd century AD, condemned woman for the crucifixion of Christ, because he said that women have their nature originating with Eve. Eve seduced Adam from the exalted purpose of his life. This gave rise to original sin. As a consequence of original sin, Christ had to be crucified and descended into hell for 3 days. So he blames womankind for the crucifixion of Christ. And a passage from Tertullian says to women, "The sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must of necessity live too. You are the devil's gateway. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack," and so on. One of the church councils in 585 AD said, "If women have souls, they must be inferior to those of men, like the souls of beasts." The record of Islam, as it deviated from its original teachings with its rise of ecclesiastical structure and theology, is no more exalted than that of Christianity. Generally, contemporary Muslim theologians have formulated a view of women which is based upon 3 principles. One, that biological differences such as menstruation cause inequality of women in relation to men. Secondly, that the male sex drive is uncontrollable and hence women should be secluded in everyday life. And thirdly, that the male has authority in the home. So we find with the resurgence of Muslim fundamentalism that present-day Islamic law is becoming more and more discriminatory towards women, not only in their seclusion, in the use of the veil, the restriction of rights of education, but in the legal structure. For example, in one Muslim country, today, if a woman accuses a man of rape and it's not proven, she herself is then charged with adultery. I read recently about a blind, pregnant teenager in a Muslim country who was sentenced to 15 lashes and 3 years in prison because she was unable to prove that she had been raped. Difficult to prove because she was blind. This traditional view of the suppression of women, of the denial of their rights, is to some extent resurgent in the world today with the rise of fundamentalism in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, and in other religions. Now let's look at the contemporary scene. Over the last 100 years we find a dual perspective. On the one hand, there are significant developments in the move to equality, yet on the other hand, there are deficiencies which still exist, which provide an arena for the Baha'i community and the Baha'i teachings to play an important role. There have been moves towards equality, for example, in education, the development of women's colleges, co-education in universities,